The night before launch, Florida forgot it was Florida. The wind felt thin. The gantries at pad 39 had turned into a rack for ice. Water lines froze into white cords. A film of frost mapped itself along handrails and platforms, and technicians stepping off the elevator found crunch in their footstep. The shuttle stack, an elegant tower on good days, looked newly rigid in the hard air, as if the cold had reached through the paint and into the joints. At the Cape, Al McDonald pressed a phone to his ear in the cold and listened for data. He had already been on the line with Utah. He knew the numbers were moving the wrong way. When he called back, the forecast was blunt. NASA meteorologists expected the air to fall below freezing before midnight, sink toward 22 degrees by early morning, and climb only to about 26 at the opening of the window. That launch window had been a horizon of hope after delays and scrubbed attempts. Now, it looked like a trap. McDonald told Bob Ebeling to have the Morton Thiokol engineering team estimate the temperature of the O-rings inside the solid rocket booster joints at ignition. He also asked them to model what the cold would do to the field joints. He wanted a minimum safe temperature for launch, ready for a teleconference with NASA. He insisted the final recommendation come from the division engineering chief, Bob Lund. This had to be an engineering decision, not a program management decision. The system demanded clarity, and the cold, at least, was clear. Across 2 time zones in Utah, men who had spent years with the boosters turned to data and memory. The field joint was more than a drawing to them. The field joint was more than a drawing to them. They knew how the rubber should seat, and that it had to be warm enough to flex at ignition. Any delay in seating left a gap that flame could exploit. They also knew the putty meant to slow heat could mask a flaw. Reviews had shown that seating the O-ring at about 200 pounds per square inch could blow a hole through that putty, an opening no one knew about on launch day. The putty was supposed to protect the seals. In some cases, that protection might already be gone, and no one would know until it was too late. Pair that with a freeze, and the gut feeling was not subtle. The teleconference convened on the evening of January 27th. The line bridged Utah to Alabama to Florida. Engineers to managers. Cold air to a warm desire to fly. Morton Thiokol engineers laid out their case. Past flights had seen erosion and blow-by in the seals at relatively warmer temperatures. The trend, they argued, was not comforting. With the air this cold, the O-rings would be stiffer. They would not respond as designed. Their recommendation was simple to say and hard to accept. Do not launch below a minimum temperature that kept the seals pliant. Engineers suggested a floor drawn from the warmest data point associated with visible trouble. The Cape did not clear that line. Wait. What happened next still stings in the retelling. At Marshall Space Flight Center, managers pushed back. They questioned whether the data established a clean causal link between ambient temperature and seal performance. They asked for numbers, then asked those numbers to carry the weight of proof. In that moment, the burden shifted. Instead of asking if it was safe to fly, the call began to ask the engineers to prove that it was unsafe. A familiar rule in high-risk work slipped. In a system designed around proof of safety, the request turned into proof of failure. On the line, tension took the shape of charts, anecdotes, and tight breaths. The engineering team worked the knowns. The worst erosion had occurred on a cooler day. The best behavior had arrived with warmth. Cold slows rubber. That was not a theory. It was material science. But the record was not a perfect laboratory. Flights differed. Joint rotation varied. Pressure curves were cousins, not twins. And in the gaps, the managers found room to argue that cold was only one factor, not the decisive one. Marshall managers asked how a new temperature limit could be justified without a full statistical model. They asked if the erosion seen before, though worrying, had still been survivable, and if the joint might tolerate one more flight in the cold. The engineers heard something else. They heard the standard drifting from what we know to what we can get away with. Thiokol took a break. The pause was short, but it was heavy. Inside the company, managers and engineers faced each other. The strongest technical voices, Roger Boisley and Bob Ebeling among them, stood by the no-go. The cold made their case. The data supported caution, and they believed the joint could not be trusted at those temperatures. Yet the weight did not balance purely on data. Program managers felt pressure from a schedule that had already bent, from a promise to launch a teacher into space, from a national audience now tuned to a date. In that private space, something gave. The recommendation that began as no-go began to soften. Bob Lund, the engineering chief whom McDonald had positioned as the decision voice, was urged to factor in more than the charts. The pivot was not a single sentence, it was a mood that turned. When the call resumed, Thiokol's management spoke for the company. Their position had changed. The launch could proceed. On paper, the case presented to NASA treated the data as inconclusive on temperature as a primary driver. The conclusion that followed leaned on hope. The joint would behave as before. Any erosion would be tolerable again, and the risk of delay would exceed the risk of flight. It read as rational analysis, and it sounded like progress. Later, the Rogers Commission would call it what it was, a faulty engineering analysis of the seal behavior. They would write that weaknesses in the safety, reliability, and quality assurance program compounded the error, and that the program failed to critique the analysis or offer an independent view during the readiness reviews. They would also point to the initial response from Marshall managers, which, in their words, led Thiokol management to discount proper technical concerns and engineering judgment in recommending launch. That night, those sentences did not exist. The only warning that existed was the one that had been muted. Those sentences, the one that had been muted. At the Cape, McDonald had not forgotten his own instruction. He had insisted the recommendation be an engineering decision. He had watched as the recommendation changed. He knew the air would be colder at dawn than any day they had flown. He watched ice cling to the fixed service structure and the platform leading to the pad escape system. That platform, a route of last resort, would be sheathed in ice by morning. Even that later would draw criticism from the Commission. No launch should have been permitted until the ice was cleared. Ice teams and Rockwell contractors would say they could not predict how ice would behave when engines ignited, whether it would shatter and strike the orbiter. The program manager for the shuttle would decide to fly despite that uncertainty. But the launch director would be cited for failing to place safety paramount in judging readiness. But all of that was still a few hours away. In the moment, the more specific, more technical warning about the solid rocket booster seals had just been pushed aside. There was paperwork for this mission, stacks and sign-offs, briefings and reviews. In that record, the Rogers Commission later found not a single mention of the O-ring problem during the flight readiness process for this launch. Several inches of documents, yet the hazard that haunted the engineers did not appear. The problem existed, and erosion had been seen. But the reporting system had grown blind spots. Managers at Marshall, including Larry Mulloy, had for years failed to alert their superiors to the seriousness of the failing seals. In testimony, the Commission concluded that Mulloy had misled the panel about the extent of the warnings he had provided. It also found that the director of Marshall's shuttle project's office might have violated policy by failing to report the results of the January 27th teleconference to the Associate Administrator for Spaceflight. Those findings would come later. On the night itself, the room was cold, and the chain of decision was about to harden in place. Inside the solid rocket booster, a field joint is a place of trust. Two steel cylinders meet. Between them, a spacer. In that seam, live the seals, twin O-rings designed to flex under pressure and close, with vigor against hot gas and flame. When ignition comes, pressure surges. The rubber must snap outward fast. If cold has stiffened it, that snap can lag. If a gap opens, heat can blow by. Putty sets a barrier to slow that heat, to protect the rubber from the first lick of fire. But the review teams had already worried that the very process of seating the seals, at a couple £100 per square inch, could push a blowhole through the putty. Could push a blowhole through the putty. If such a blowhole existed, no one would know in advance. A joint with a hidden hole in its shield. A morning with air like a freezer. You could argue the statistics on a conference call. The physics would not argue back. Still, the count rolled forward. Schedules are momentum in their own right. The agency had flown close to risk before and emerged intact. That arc, repeated often enough, can bend judgment. You start to treat past survival as evidence of future safety. The phrase for that is normalization of deviance. The system had survived blow-by. It had survived erosion. It had absorbed these events into a sense of tolerable risk. The engineers did not share that comfort, at least not that night. When you work a seal, you learn its language. In their understanding, the cold silenced the snap the joint needed most. Midnight arrived as forecast, hard and quiet. Somewhere in the complex, heaters hummed. A small defense against a mass of cold air that did not care about heaters. The astronauts slept, or tried to. The teacher, the nation had fallen in love with, lay unaware of the arguments happening under her mission. Ground crews moved as they always moved, deliberate and sure, because every task had a procedure, and every procedure had a step. You can do your job perfectly in a process that has already decided to ignore the simplest warning. That is another part of the paradox of that night. The people closest to the hazard did not have the authority to freeze the day. The people with the authority did not carry the hazard in their bones. Dawn would bring cameras and children in schoolrooms, and a sky so clear that the plume would look drawn in chalk. The launch would go, and the joint, and the O-ring already nicked by a cold night, would both become a diagram drawn on the wind. But we are not there yet. We are still in the moment when a single conference call mattered more than any rollout or rollout speech. We are still next to a battered phone at the Cape and a table with coffee cooling in Utah. What began as a no-go ended in a go. The official pathway, the one that produces the paper trail for a mission, did not record the danger the engineers could feel in their teeth. In the sections ahead, we will follow the signatures and the silences. We will see how an engineer's warning was put in writing, how a manager's push recast risk as uncertainty, and how a commission took sworn testimony and shaped it into findings that stripped away alibis. We will also take apart the joint itself. Because it is not enough to say a seal failed. We need to understand why rubber needs warmth, and how a small, hidden void in putty can doom a launch you cannot stop once it begins. And we will keep returning to this night, the night before Challenger, when the air was colder than any previous flight, and the system, under pressure, turned a red flag into a green light. Picture the shuttle's two white solid rocket boosters as giant stacked drums. Their steel cases are joined in the open air by rings of bolts and faith in precision. Each booster arrived in Florida in segments. Those segments met at what engineers called field joints, where a tongue of metal, the tang, slid into a matching socket, the clevis. Inside that narrow circular meeting point, two rubbery seals made of a fluorocarbon sold under the trade name Viton were squeezed into grooves to keep 800 tons of propellant from turning a small gap into a blowtorch. The language for such a thing is tidy. A primary O-ring and a secondary O-ring. But the physics are not. At ignition, the booster pressure jumps like a slammed door. The steel case flexes, and the joint prays open by hair widths. The rings must come to life fast enough to chase that opening and hold back a storm of heat. The design relied on a simple truth about elastomers. Under load they deform and flow. They press into voids when pressure pushes them, and they spring back when that load eases. In a warm shop, Viton can rebound like a finger pressed into a tennis ball. In the chill of a winter morning, the same ring can be stubborn and slow. That difference, measured in milliseconds, matters when the case wall around it is trying to wrench away. If the gap opens faster than the rubber can move and seal, hot gas can jet past the first ring. That is blow-by. if grains of that heat carve a path into the ring itself, eating it away like a river eats a bank. That is erosion. The second ring waits beyond as a backup, but only if the timing is merciful and the ring is warm enough to be flicked into place by the rush of pressure. This was the brittle edge of routine. Before the accident, engineers had already seen the signs. Lights returned with black soot where none should be. Dark stains beneath insulation, putty meant to be a shield. They found sections of the primary O-rings worn down. A few hundredths of an inch of rubber turned to char. On one early flight, the blow-by was so conspicuous that photos of the joint components became talismans in meetings, proof that the field joint was not the static, well-behaved interface it was on paper. The record cold launch a year before Challenger's final flight was the starkest case. That mission came back with significant erosion and evidence that hot gas had threaded a path deeper than anyone could accept. If that could happen at temperatures in the 50s, engineers asked what would happen near freezing. Morton Thiokol, the booster contractor, did not speak from anecdote alone. They built subscale joints and mechanical rigs to mimic the way the steel case flexed during that first flash of pressure. They warmed and cooled samples. They dragged them open and slammed them closed. Bench testing showed that the O-ring could not reliably keep contact with the metal parts as the gap opened to its maximum during pressurization, especially when cold. Static motor firings, full scale on the desert floor, echoed the same theme, with scorch marks that slipped where they should not have. In a world of rockets, data is never truly complete. But a pattern had formed. Low temperatures made the rings stiff. Stiff rings reacted slower. Slow seals allowed hot gas to get a head start. Once it started, erosion made the backup less backup than hope. Among the voices raising alarms was Roger Boisjoli, a seal specialist at Thiokol, who had watched black soot streaks accumulate flight by flight. Months before the final launch, he wrote internal memos, urging a redesign and warning that the joint could fail catastrophically if the pattern continued. In late summer, he carried a set of charts to Washington that laid the engineer's logic bare. One chart, which he would show again on the eve of launch without a word changed, captured the main worry at 2 moments. The ignition transient, when the joint opens fastest, and the steady state of ascent, when pressure remains high. If erosion penetrated the primary ring, the chance of losing the secondary seal, especially in that steady state, rose to an unacceptable level. Bench tests had shown that the ring could not chase the widening gap fast enough to maintain sealing contact up to maximum pressure. That is not how a double seal is meant to work. A backup that arrives late is not a backup. The joint had other defenders on paper. There was a layer of zinc chromate putty between the hot propellant and the rings, meant to act like a soft dam against the first flash of gas. In ideal assembly, the putty packed every crevice. In the real world, it could crack or leave thin spots. A small void, almost harmless to the eye under fluorescent light, became a lane for flame at ignition. The earliest hot jets did not need a large opening, only a start. Once gas found a seam, it carried soot like a tracer, leaving a black signature on parts that should have stayed clean. Engineers could not see the putty inside an assembled booster at the pad. They depended on assembly records, on the discipline of process, and on post-flight teardowns to speak for what the eye could not. Those teardowns kept talking. When most things are nominal, anomalies become fragile facts. Each flight presented just 2 big samples, a left booster and a right. Temperatures at the pad varied with the season. Assembly details varied with crews. Each joint had dozens of subtle differences in shim thickness, grease application, and alignment that never made it into a spreadsheet. Engineers tried to plot erosion depth against temperature, to divine a neat curve. But the points danced. Some flights at moderate temperatures showed modest erosion. Some showed more. The coldest prior flight stood out. But the chain was not mathematically clean. That became the crevice through which argument later flowed. Managers looking for coherence said the data did not make a single consistent story. Engineers looking at physics said the trend was clear enough when clean stories are rare in real life. In that space between neat and urgent, the clock kept time. The Rogers Commission later found that the problem was known in time to redesign and build new joints before the accident. It concluded that years of poor technical decisions kept an unsafe motor flying. Budget pressure and the push to deliver a vehicle meant to fly often shaped choices, starting with the decision to use segmented solid rockets. The performance specification did not account for winter on Florida's coast. The new joint design was accepted with too little certification and testing. A NASA engineer, John Miller, urged a redesign of the clevis on incoming hardware at the earliest date, but his advice was not adopted. Instead of calling erosion a joint failure, managers set an upper limit for acceptable O-ring erosion. A threshold drawn more from a computer model than from the stark fact of burned rubber. And despite more than 4 years of flights that sent the same warning, no new field joint or nozzle joint was designed, tested, and put into service. Inside Thiokol, the tone of warning did not come from performance theater or abstract fear. It came from shop floor evidence and field returns. Letters and memos carried the fatigue of repetition. Engineers asked for a capture feature, a change that would prevent the joint from prying open under pressure by physically restraining the clevis and tang. They asked for improved putty practice. They argued for seals that would seat faster at low temperatures, or for a pause in winter operations until a fix could be flown. Each request met the realities of contract and calendar. Redesign meant delays that would ripple through manifests already promised to customers, and a space agency that hoped for a flight every couple of weeks. Redesign meant costs that had no easy sponsor. So proposals entered review, studies were commissioned, timelines drifted, and the flying kept going. The word acceptable began to do work it was never meant to do. There is a human urge to believe that problems we have survived are problems we will survive again. Flights came back with eroded rings, yet the boosters held. The paint stayed on the fairings, and the crew walked down the steps smiling. With each near miss that left no crater, the sense of normal bent a little more. Erosion shifted from a warning to a nuisance, then to a managed parameter. Blow-by was cast as a surface effect, not a sign of deeper trouble when temperatures seemed to cooperate. The culture learned to treat a dangerous symptom as a fact of life. In that environment, data that is not neat becomes easier to file under watch, not halt. Engineers like Boisjoli kept reminding colleagues that the next data point could sit far from the mean, that a colder day would not be a linear step, but a jump into a different joint behavior. The physics had no sympathy for our tolerance for ambiguity. The physics had no sympathy for our tolerance for ambiguity. The booster joint demanded speed from its rings at a moment when temperature steals speed. The first flicker of ignition shoves pressure into every seam. The steel case balloons outward by tiny amounts, prying the tang and clevis apart. The O-ring, squeezed in its groove, must be instantly pushed by that pressure against the opposite wall to seal. That means the ring must compress, deform, and slide with almost no time to waste. Tests showed that when the compound is cold, the ring does not rebound like a spring. It behaves more like wax, moving sluggishly. When that sluggishness meets a racing gap, there is a window, small but real, in which flame is faster than rubber. If that window opens, the primary ring can be nibbled away before the secondary ring has any chance to be in place. The backup works only if the system gives it time to become the new primary. Cold shortens time. At Thiokol, subscale rigs tried to pin down that window. Engineers machined steel to match the flight hardware's thickness and stiffness, then used hydraulics to mimic how fast the joint opened in the first split second. They chilled samples across a range of temperatures and timed how long the ring took to seal. As temperatures dropped, the seal lag grew, and in some runs, The ring never reached full contact before the simulated pressure peak. Static firings left scorch tracks as evidence. When Boisjoli stood by his chart and said the bench tests showed the ring could not maintain contact through gap opening up to maximum pressure, he was speaking from those trials. He paired that with the logic that erosion of the primary makes the system fragile in steady state, because the secondary is then the only barrier between flame and steel, and it can show the same slow seal behavior if it was never seated cleanly. Against this stood numbers that felt like a bomb. Managers could point to a stack of flight reports in which no ring had burned through completely, to temperature data showing erosion that was modest or absent, and to a computer model suggesting a certain depth of erosion could be tolerated without a breach. The math suggested control, a map with firm edges. In meetings, it is easier to manage a boundary than to face a hazard that refuses to be linear. The Commission would later stress that setting any upper limit on seal damage during operation is a retreat from the principle that a seal must not be damaged at all. The seal is not a sacrificial component. It is what keeps the cauldron from emptying into the gap. The decision chain had a fracture. The people who managed contracts and schedules did not sit with stained hardware every week. The people who did were not always in the rooms where final go or no-go calls were made. On paper, organization charts promise clarity, but on the ground, levels blur. The Commission later recorded that senior decision-makers said they did not know, on the night before the launch, that the O-ring issue was the subject of intense controversy. They added that they would not have approved a launch if they had heard the engineers' views. That gap in awareness began in meetings like one held months earlier, when the summer chart on ignition transients and steady-state risk did not cross the threshold of urgency beyond the engineering tier. The warning existed, it circulated, it did not rain. At the same time, the booster program was not a free agent. The shuttle's image as a routine bust to orbit was both a promise and a debt. The manifest was crowded with payloads from the Department of Defense to commercial satellites. The agency had sold the idea that a single reusable machine could fly often and affordably, and the budgets were written in that font. Cost-cutting shaped choices at the start, from the decision to use large segmented solid rockets designed and built by an external contractor, to the ways testing and certification were scoped. Once flying began, every threat to schedule pressed against the institutional instinct to keep moving. Delay today meant rework across months. Against that pressure, an engineer's red flag needed coherence that satisfied not only physics, but also the comfort of the calendar. Within that pressure, the meaning of data hardened. Managers at Marshall Space Flight Center began to ask for evidence that fit a strict pattern. But if the hazard was real, the story had to show a consistent relationship between temperature and erosion across the whole set of flights. Engineers argued that they had enough to know low temperatures were dangerous, even if the scatter worried statisticians, and they returned to mechanisms rather than only to plot. Vuitton's glass transition properties, the way viscosity changes with temperature, the rate at which a ring can snap back. These were not hand-waving but tangible behavior. They said that in compression set tests the ring recovered slowly when cold, and that the joint's geometry magnified the penalty. The arguments did not cancel each other. They spoke past each other, one asking for a perfect line, the other pointing at a real cliff. All of this lived inside a steel circle, perhaps 2 hands wide, multiplied by 6 around each booster. It is natural to imagine that a hazard so grave must wear a dramatic face, that it would be obvious at a glance. In truth, the warning lived in soot stains and measurements, scribbled on tear-down reports, in a handful of degrees by the thermometer, in bench rigs cold enough to sting a finger. It lived in a test that showed the ring taking too long to seat, and in a photograph from a year-old flight that looked too much like a burn scar. The risk accrued in a way that rewards short memory and punishes doubt. Each mitigation that fell short, each review that acknowledged concern yet kept the line moving, set the stage for the argument to come. When night and ice wrapped pad 39B, the field joint and its 2 rings were not ignorant. They had been trying to speak for years. On the eve of that final countdown, the problem was neither new nor abstract. It was a seal with a history, written flight by flight, memo by memo, test by test. Engineers could point to bench results showing delayed sealing at low temperature. They could point to the summer chart warning that if the primary burned, the secondary offered little hope during the steady climb. They could point to the cold launch a year before and its troubling erosion. They could point to design acceptance and certification gaps the Commission would later spell out. Performance specs had dismissed winter, and tolerances were grounded in models, not in the truth of a burned ring. What they could not produce was a neat regression line to reassure a manager who preferred coherence over caution. That last call for coherence was sensible in a laboratory, but in rocketry, it can become a trap. The boosters had not yielded enough clean data at very low temperatures, because the fleet rarely flew there, and because no one wanted to stay there long enough to draw a tidy curve. In such cases, you return to mechanism and prudence. You do not expect a colder day to make rubber faster. You do not expect a joint that pries open to be kinder because television cameras are watching. And you remember that when heat gets to the wrong side of a pressure seal, it does not negotiate. The Commission's later phrase, that there were 7 different moments when poor technical decisions allowed an unsafe design to keep flying, did not come from one meeting. It came from a slow braid of acceptance that ran through years. By the time the teleconference fax pages stopped curling on desks in Florida, the history of the joint and its rings should have felt like a case file too heavy to ignore. It carried early blow-by, bench tests where cold rings failed to keep up with the gap, summer warnings that a burned primary left the secondary alone in a hostile environment, a long cape, winter missing from the specifications, and an institutional habit of turning erosion into a number that looked manageable. That weight would meet a different kind of gravity in the hours that followed, when words like coherence, proof, and acceptable were deployed as if the joint itself could hear them. But inside the booster, at the aft field joint of the right-hand rocket, the Vuitton rings had no language for those debates. They had physics, and on a freezing morning, physics takes the first and last word. Even with forensic hindsight, the picture is stark. The Commission would say, without doubt, that the 7 astronauts were doomed by the failure of a single Vuitton pressure seal in that aft field joint. It would note that top NASA decision-makers at the highest levels later said they did not know the seal had been the focus of intense controversy. They would say they would not have launched if they had known. Those are facts for later chapters. For now, to follow what happened that night, hold the mechanism in mind. A joint that opens, a ring that must move, cold that slows it. A flame that treats any opening as its right. Engineers watched, measured, and warned. They asked for redesign, for restraint, for time. Their data was messy and alarming in equal measure. They went into the night knowing that a seal obedient in summer could turn stubborn by dawn, and that such stubbornness is no small nuisance when it is the only barrier between ignition and a path for fire. The phone lines opened across 3 time zones as the cold pressed in from every direction. In Utah, engineers bent over charts and notes. In Alabama, Marshall managers settled into conference chairs with the confidence of people who believed they had seen every version of risk. In Florida, the Cape waited under a clear, bitter sky. Their link was thin, a voice path, and a promise to decide before dawn. Hours earlier, Al McDonald had set this stage. He had insisted the final word come from engineering, not program management. And he had pushed his team to calculate what the cold would do inside the booster joints. From NASA's meteorologists he had learned this would not be a brief dip. Temperatures were predicted to drop below freezing before midnight, then sink to the low 20s by morning, with the launch window opening in air that might climb only a few degrees. That meant the steel casings would be cold, the putties stiff, and the Vuitton O-rings colder still. The call began with numbers. On the Utah end, Roger Boisjoli and Bob Ebeling described the predicted temperatures of the seals in the aft field joints. They explained that the interiors of the casings would lag the air outside, so the key parts would be colder at ignition than any flight had ever seen. They reminded the line that, at warmer temperatures, the primary O-ring had already eroded, and hot gas had already stained the metal beyond the seal. They had bench data, test history, and a simple argument that anyone could rehearse in their head. These O-rings have to move and seal in milliseconds. In cold weather, they move slowly. If they do not seal in time, hot gas will cut past. If the primary fails to seal fast enough, the secondary may not be there, because joint rotation can lift it out of contact at pressurization. Their tone, measured but urgent, carried a plea that was not melodrama. Delay this launch. Choose a day when the risk is normal, not unknown. The team showed scatter plots that tied blow-by and erosion to lower temperatures. They acknowledged the scatter and walked through why it existed. Not every joint sees the same stress. Not every assembly step leaves the same minute path through putty. But the trend, they said, was real enough where it mattered. The worst damage had happened at lower temperatures. On a night this cold, the data could not hold the line they needed. They proposed a minimum temperature for launch, a threshold that landed in the low 50s Fahrenheit, and anything below that was a no-go. When asked about the secondary ring, they answered with caution. Do not bet a vehicle and a crew on a backup seal that might not be in position when the joint flexes. That is not redundancy at all. It is a false comfort. Larry Mulloy from Marshall cut into the flow. His voice, later described as pugnacious before the Rogers Commission, first sounded practical and skeptical. He said the data did not cohere. He asked whether blow-by at higher temperatures undermined the proposed threshold. He pressed for causal certainty, not a pattern with exceptions. He pointed to previous flights where erosion had not led to leakage, where other factors might explain the damage. George Hardy, another senior figure at Marshall, listened, then registered something more emotional. Roger Boisjoli would later testify that Marshall had said they were appalled at the recommendation not to launch. That word, appalled, has a sharpness that still stings when you hear it. To the engineers on the Utah end, the message felt like a rebuke, not only to their data, but to their instinct to draw a line on a life-and-death decision. The drift of the conversation shifted in a way that is hard to hear in the moment. It begins as a debate about whether the data show danger. It becomes a demand to prove catastrophe. Mulloy, in later testimony, would say he had not been convinced because the data did not seem coherent. Bob Lund, then the senior engineering voice at Thiokol, would later say he felt forced to invert the usual priorities. Instead of demonstrating that the hardware was safe to fly, he was now being asked to conclusively show that it was not. That switch is small when spoken, but it is immense when deciding. It moves the burden from protection to persuasion. It implies that in the absence of perfect proof of failure, the default is to proceed. Through it, the engineers stayed on their point. They revisited the known mechanism. The joint takes milliseconds to pressurize, and in those milliseconds it rotates, opening a path that steals contact from the secondary ring. The primary must act first and fast. Temperature slows that action. They described how the material stiffens and how cold steals resilience. They repeated that this was not a minor effect. They did not claim certainty of a breach, but they stated certainty of degraded margins. They were not guessing. They were reporting the direction of the physics and the history on steel that had come back scored and darkened. They were speaking a warning, while knowing the time pressure on the other side of the line. Questions began to push the engineers back into the halls of proof. What data isolate temperature from other factors? What about the one flight that showed little erosion at a lower reading? How many points define your threshold? Could ice on the pad even make a difference inside a sealed system? When answers circled back to uncertainty and mechanism, the pressure rose. The engineers could say the cold would slow the seal, but not exactly how many degrees would cross the line into failure. They could point to blow-by at temperatures far warmer than this night, but not produce the clean regression that would soothe the manager's need for clean numbers. The sense on the Marshall side was that their contractor was asking them to scrub a mission in front of a worldwide audience on a model they did not yet fully accept. Then came the procedural turn. After exchanges that grew more brittle, the Marshall side asked Morton Thiokol to go offline for a private caucus and return with a recommendation. The word recommendation does a lot of work in this story. McDonald had pressed before the call that this had to be an engineering decision. Now, the request landed with a different weight. Come back not with an argument, but with a single bottom line. The Utah line muted. The room at Marshall stayed open. In Florida, the Cape waited. In Utah, a handful of people closed a door. Inside that room, you can imagine the air. The engineers had been living inside this problem for months. They had written memos that read like alarms. They had seen soot on surfaces where it did not belong. Beside them, program managers lived with different exposures, to contracts, to customers, to reputation. The coal did not care which language they used, but language decides what happens next. Bob Ebling and Roger Boisjoli restated their position. No launch in this cold. Arnie Thompson supported them. Bob Lund, the designated engineering authority, had held to the threshold and the no-go. Then Gerald Mason, a senior executive, spoke words that would echo beyond this night. Accounts differ in phrasing, but the sentiment is clear. Take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. It was not a denial of the data. It was a recalibration of what kind of decision this had become. Time tightened. The team went back through the charts, trying to find their footing. The data would not become clearer on command. They could only state the unknowns and weigh the cost of saying no. A delay would be public, and it would ripple through schedules already strained by slips. It would also announce that a system sold as mature carried a serious flaw in weather a Florida winter might bring any year. On the other side sat seals that had eroded but had not yet failed catastrophically, and a secondary ring that might hold, though not by design in this corner case. The engineers held their ground. The room's gravity shifted under them. Bob Lund changed his recommendation. Later, in front of commissioners and cameras, he would acknowledge that he felt pushed to invert proof that he should have maintained his no-go. In the room, the words tipped the entire enterprise. With Lund's reversal, Joe Kilminster, as the program manager who would transmit the official position, had a single line to carry back. Thiokol would recommend launch. The caucus broke, and the Utah line went live again. Outside the room, none of the physics had changed. Back on the teleconference, Kilminster delivered the recommendation. The temperature threshold had not changed, and the winter night was as cold as it had been minutes before. The engineers who had urged a no-go fell quiet under the chain of authority. At the Cape, Al McDonald refused to sign off. He would not authorize a launch at that temperature. But the formal process did not need his signature to proceed. A fax would send Thiokol's reversal to Marshall. Then up the chain, and the risk would be recorded as accepted on the grounds of insufficient proof of failure, rather than insufficient proof of safety. On the Marshall side, skepticism about the data gave way to acceptance of the contractor's bottom line. Larry Mulloy, who had pushed the conversation toward coherence, now had a contractor saying they would fly. The request for a management decision was met with a management decision. George Hardy, appalled only minutes earlier, was no longer in a position to be persuaded by an engineer's alarm, because that alarm had been muted by the engineer's boss. The people on the line did not conduct a formal probabilistic risk analysis in the remaining minutes. They received a recommendation that unlocked the pad. In the paperwork that followed, according to the Rogers Commission, the O-ring hazard did not appear. Through a stack several inches thick, There was not a single mention of the problem in the general readiness documentation of the mission. That absence did more than hide a dissenting view. It erased from the official record a known, argued, temperature-sensitive flaw. The absence was later judged as blindness, not oversight, a symptom of an agency that had become more devoted to meeting a schedule than interrogating a warning that threatened it. What ended up on paper was a green light. What stayed off paper were the voices who had said stop. The record of who said yes and who objected lived for the moment, in memories and in the brittle phone traffic from the night. The yes came from Kilminster's transmission of Thiokol's changed recommendation. The acceptance came from Malloy in the Marshall chain. The objections came from Ebeling, Boisjoli, and Thompson in Utah, and from McDonald in Florida, with a caveat that Lund's reversal removed the formal standing of the engineering no-go. The language of the night had been sharpened by the word appalled. The gravity of the night had been fixed by a demand to prove failure rather than justify safety. The traces of the night's tension barely crossed into the paperwork that counted. Later, the Rogers Commission dragged these threads back into view. They quoted engineers under oath. They established that Malloy had applied pressure to reverse the no-go. They concluded that had the seriousness of the concerns been passed up the chain in clear terms, the launch would not have proceeded. They called out a blindness that was not simple ignorance, but a culture's habit of discounting warnings that did not come packaged in perfect data. In one exchange that said as much with a sigh as with a question, General Donald Kutina, himself a pilot and engineer, pressed a senior Thiokol executive about what had driven them. Something must be achieved, Kutina said. What was driving here? What caused you to go? It is not a technical question. It is a question about the human load on a decision. None of those questions were asked on the line that night. The questions on the line were about flights and weather windows, about whether threads of data could be tied into a knot strong enough to hold back a countdown. The answer, made in a small room during an offline caucus, unlocked the rest. The role of the engineer narrowed to explanation. The role of management swelled to verdict. When the call ended, the night was not any warmer. Ice still grew and held on railings and handrails around the pad. The dark hour, with its sensors and crank radios, turned slowly toward a dawn that would not soften quickly. In the morning, it would matter that a decision made on a foam bridge could not change what polymers do when cold, or how steel tolerances shift when shrunken at the margins. It would matter that nothing in mechanics respects the emotional relief that comes with a final yes. But those are the facts of what happens next. On this night, the crucial fact is quieter. The red line had been turned to green without adding a single proof point that the danger had receded. Instead, the demand for certainty had been placed on the people preaching caution, and when they could not conjure it on command, their caution was recast as conjecture. There is a human echo in Bob Lund's later testimony. He was asked why he had not held to his original no-go, why he had not refused a management decision that cut against engineering judgment. He paused for a long time and said, "That is probably what I should have done." Those are not the words of a villain. They are the words of someone who felt the pull of a system with no good place for uncertainty, where a launch schedule had the momentum of an assumption. In that system, a perfect argument against flying would be welcomed. An imperfect argument for waiting could be seen as disloyal to the goal. Hours after the call, formality reasserted itself. Lines on checklists were marked complete. The pad crew shifted from de-icing to countdown thinking, a surreal pivot for anyone who had seen the glaze still holding on the metal around them. Cameras were readied for a classroom that would tune in from Concord, New Hampshire, and for a country that had started to treat shuttle launches as background achievement. The decision made in the small room in Utah, to recommend launch despite cold, threaded quietly through all that activity. It did not need a fanfare. It had force enough on its own. In the story of Challenger, this is the pivot that cannot be unwound. It is the place where a technical red flag slid under a green header. It is also the place where you can see, in one tight sequence, how organizations convert doubt into assent. They ask for coherence. They challenge mechanisms. They absorb a warning into a process that protects a schedule. They move a demand for certainty to the shoulder of those who cannot produce it without time and better data. Then they call for a recommendation and invite management to carry the heaviest word, yes. And with that word, everything downstream rearranges itself as if the risk had shifted, when in truth only the posture had. The night ended without applause. Offices and phone rooms went quiet as people headed home or back to quarters, their pockets buzzing with the dull relief of a decision made. A few carried the opposite feeling, a hollow tension that would not settle. They had seen the path inside the joint in their minds and could not replace it with anything better on the fly. The record would not carry their voices clearly. They would have to bring them later, under oath, with charts rebuilt for daylight. For now the lines fell silent, and the air stayed cold. The shuttle waited on the pad for the morning that would test every assumption made in the room where a recommendation turned. The day before Challenger left the pad, a table in a Florida conference room sagged under binders meant to prove that everything had been checked. The flight readiness review, the ritual that should have forced hard questions, presented thickness as reassurance. Lines were signed, systems were declared ready, and the record of descent was tidy, almost polite. Yet inside those binders, one word was strangely quiet. The O-rings, which had left soot marks and worried the people who handled the stained steel, were not flagged as a flight constraint for 51LL. The system produced an all-clear that did not match what some engineers were seeing and saying. It was the sound of a machine that could not quite hear itself. The Flight Readiness Review, or FAR, stood between routine and risk. Before each mission, contractors and NASA centers gathered anomalies, analyses, and action items. These reports were meant to show what had gone wrong, what was being tracked, and what might still fail if an old problem returned. Senior managers used that map to decide whether to proceed. In theory, FAR forced evidence to confront authority. In practice on this mission, the Commission later wrote, the FRR failed to surface the solid rocket motor joint hazard with the force it deserved. Safety, reliability, and quality assurance did not provide the independent perspective those senior managers needed. The process cleared the launch because the paperwork said, go. How did that happen when the hardware had been speaking for years through blow-by and erosion marks? The answer sat in an analysis that cast those marks as manageable. NASA's decision to launch was based on a faulty engineering analysis of the SRM field joint seal behavior. The core assumption held that pressurization would quickly seat the primary O-ring, and that even with some erosion, the secondary O-ring would act as a backstop. It was a comforting theory, suggesting a safety margin that might not exist at low temperatures. Tests and flight histories were read through that lens, turning damage into proof that the seal system could tolerate abuse. As the air grew colder, that frame grew shakier. As the air grew colder, that frame grew shakier. Hidden within the stack of assumptions was a simple mechanical quirk the Commission highlighted. The 200 pounds per square inch seating pressure that was supposed to push the O-ring into position could produce a blowhole in the putty ahead of the joint. That putty was intended to serve as a heat shield. A blowhole would be a tiny channel, not visible before launch, that let hot gases rush where the O-rings waited. If a joint went up with an unseen blowhole and a cold, sluggish seal, the very act of seating could invite flame to beat the seal to its seat. In other words, the safeguard used to justify confidence could punch a hole through the shield that the O-rings relied on. The EFR did not weigh that contradiction the way the hardware would. Years of experience with non-catastrophic erosion had taught the program to live with symptoms. That living had a name in the Commission's subtext, later echoed by sociologists who studied disasters: normalization of deviance. When early flights showed soot past the primary O-ring and char along the groove, it was alarming. Then it became a data point. Then it became a manageable quirk. Then it became a manageable quirk. Every successful return slipped the threshold for alarm. The trend line toward colder weather was masked by scatter and operational pride. The scientist's impulse to explain turned into a manager's impulse to accept. Repeated survival entered the culture as evidence of safety, not luck. Anomalies continued to be tracked, but in a system that struggled to translate warning into constraint, tracking became a way to contain fear rather than to stop the countdown. Safety, reliability, and quality assurance should have cut through that drift. The Commission found that these offices had failed to exercise control over the problem tracking systems, had not critiqued the engineering analysis advanced as an explanation of the solid rocket motor seal problem, and had not provided the independent perspective required by senior NASA managers at flight readiness reviews. Those words were not abstractions. They pointed to eroded staffing, shrinking authority, and a loss of technical muscle at the very layer meant to ask whether a comfortable model still matched the world. Over the previous decade, NASA's workforce had tightened. A disproportionate share of cuts fell on safety and reliability staff at headquarters and at the Marshall Space Flight Center. When the watchers are thinned, the watched begin to set their own tests. The Flight Readiness Review became less a courtroom and more a recital. Independence was not the only thing missing. The form of argument had inverted. On the night before launch, Marshall managers pressed Thiokol for proof of catastrophe rather than proof of safety. That is a subtle but powerful shift. In a well-tuned risk system, the burden of proof sits with the assertion that a system is safe to fly, not with the person warning that it may fail. The FIR structure should have rewarded caution and elevated uncertainty. Instead, across months of reviews, the steady drumbeat of launch dates and completed missions pulled the standard the other way. Anomalies that did not collapse into a single definitive failure mechanism were tolerated, and in that tolerance, they earned their way out of constraints and into background noise. These quiet shifts in process showed up in louder ways during the final hours. The Commission's review of the countdown tapes captured another breach. Launch commit criteria were waived on January 27 and 28, without a valid technical reason. On the morning itself, ice from the liquid oxygen vent arm was recognized as a definite threat to the orbiter. Rockwell engineers raised alarms, and Rockwell had already found a predictive model inadequate for judging the risk. Yet the Space Transportation System Manager relied on analysis at Kennedy and Johnson that used that same inadequate model, and pressed on. The habit of permitting optimistic calculations to overrule visible hazards did not start with the O-rings. It joined them, and together they made an unsafe picture look marginally acceptable. Problem tracking, the daily bookkeeping of risk, also fell short. A good tracking system does not just collect issues. It classifies them in a way that drives action. Is this a trend that must be closed before flight? Or a watch item that can ride? The Commission said the safety program had not exercised control over those systems. The O-ring erosion and blow-by lived in logs and charts. But they did not stand up in the FAR for 51L as a line that said no. They were not present in the launch packet with the force of a constraint, and that absence mattered. Even a strong dissent, if it lives outside the official record, is easy to set aside. The result was a launch record that read as if a known hazard had been resolved when it had only been explained. In theory, the principal contractors could have yanked the handbrake with a clear final statement against launch. The Commission observed, however, that there was no firm requirement to secure their concurrence at the moment of launch. That lack of a hard line partially relieved them of responsibility for mission success. It also left a gray space where responsibility should have been bright. The recommendation afterward was simple: require every principal contractor to make an unambiguous launch readiness statement just prior to liftoff. On the night of the teleconference, Thiokol's executives learned how a vacuum of procedure can grab hold of human doubt. The same vacuum existed at the pad. When a system cannot force its participants to speak at defined moments, the strongest voice in the room tends to be schedule. The missing lines ran all the way back to Washington. Months before the accident, on August 19, 1985, information presented to NASA headquarters about the joint seal was, in the Commission's words, enough to require immediate and concentrated efforts. Yet that effort did not become a redesign on the pad, a constraint in the Flight Readiness Review for Mission 51L, or clear rule that cold weather would shut the joint down. The hazard was not a secret. It was a risk announced, but not absorbed. Oversight at the top heard the warning, yet in a network where every ear had softened, the signal faded into the hum of operations. The culture also carried a more ordinary weight, the sort that rarely appears in findings but fills hallways. The shuttle program was under pressure to prove itself routine. Flights were promised to customers. A national spotlight sat on this mission for reasons that had nothing to do with joints or putty. Budgets were finite. Delays looked like broken promises, and the clock ticked across quarters as much as across days. None of that forced the O-rings to fail. But it did condition the threshold where someone could say, "We will not fly today." When calendars count as much as cautions, every review becomes a negotiation with time. What began as engineering can end as diplomacy, and the numbers lose their sharp edges. Inside the joint, though, there were no negotiations. The putty could form a blowhole during pressurization. The steel casings could flex as pressure and heat surged. Investigators ruled out contamination or foreign object damage and did not find that stacking mishaps contributed to this accident. The danger was not a single botched procedure. It was a recurring weakness in the field joint design, blamed and tracked and explained, then gradually accepted as survivable. The FRR for 51L did not bring that pattern into the open where it could stop the mission. It filed the pattern into history and moved forward. Every organization that handles danger chooses how to treat uncertainty. Some set conservative launch rules and enforce them with stubborn ritual. Some write rules, then invent waivers and exceptions as needed, telling themselves that this time is special, and the underlying logic holds. The Commission's recommendation to restore a more conservative set of launch rules was not a bureaucratic correction. It was an attempt to put the burden of proof back where it belonged. On January 28th, that burden had been flipped. People asked if anyone could prove the joint would fail, not whether anyone could prove the joint would seal at temperatures it had never seen. Within NASA, the checks and balances had thinned. Safety and reliability staffs had lost people and voice. At Marshall, the center closest to the solid rocket design, the program's own confidence defined the frame that safety was supposed to test. When Thiokol engineers tried to raise the temperature effect, the initial response by Marshall managers set a tone that made a later retreat by Thiokol management more likely. In a healthy system, a strong objection from the builder of the hardware would grow stronger under pressure. On the night of January 27th, it did the opposite because the surrounding structure made the warning look like an opinion rather than a constraint. In that light, the FR's silence about O-rings for 51L was not an oversight. It was an outcome. As the Commission looked across decisions, waivers, and reviews, another pattern emerged. When a model disagreed with a sideline, the model often won. Rockwell questioned the analysis used to judge ice hazards on the vent arm, calling the model inadequate. Yet decision-makers relied on that model and launched. When engineers questioned the ability of the O-rings to seat in cold, the existing model of joint behavior, built on warmer flights and repaired damage, told a safer story. Models are not villains. They are how we think at scale. But when they are not tested by independent eyes and adversarial questions, they can slowly replace the thing they represent. In the final hours, launch commit criteria became suggestions. Safety voices were present but not decisive. The ritual of Air 4 had been performed, but not fulfilled. A record that should have forced a no-go did not do so, because the process that creates the record had learned to congratulate itself for surviving its own anomalies. That is the quiet tragedy of a system that cannot hear itself. It mistakes the absence of a line in a binder for the absence of danger on a pad. It mistakes the word go for the act of being ready. There is one more hinge in this structure, and it sits in human language. The difference between we think it is safe and we can show it. It is safe becomes a blur in conversation, especially after many flights. The Commission's findings sharpened that blur. They asked managers to restore conservative rules and demanded that contractors speak in unambiguous terms at the last gate. They called out the failures of oversight and the faults in analysis. They pointed to eroded staffing in the very offices designed to say, "Stop," and they noted that months before launch, enough was known to require urgent action, not patient explanations. On the morning of January 28th, the air over the launch site was hard and cold. The countdown system ticked through pages of conditions, each one met or waived. The stack of paper said the mission was ready. The engineers who had colored their charts with cold warnings had lost the argument to a structure that trusted its own previous survival. The O-rings within the aft field joint were about to be asked a question that the FRR had not. Could they close a gap before flame arrived, with putty that could hide a channel and rubber that had stiffened in the freeze? In a few minutes the answer would come from steel and gas, not from models and meetings. A better system would have heard that moment coming and refused to proceed. The one in place generated signatures and waivers instead. It normalized a risk into routine. It let the burden of proof drift away from caution. It allowed safety to become an advisory rather than an authority. From Washington to Marshall to the firing room, it collected enough warnings to fill a file, but not enough to halt a launch. That is the anatomy of a decision, based on a faulty engineering analysis, compounded by serious ongoing weaknesses in the very program meant to guard against such errors. In the next minute of this story, pressure will build inside the solid rockets. The boosters will flex, and the joint will be forced to perform at a temperature it has never faced. The culture and the process have brought us to the edge of the pad. What happens when fire meets a cold and delayed seal is physics. Why that physics was allowed to cast the deciding vote belongs to the system we have just traced. The machine could not hear itself, so it kept talking until fire answered. Dawn over the Cape did not break so much as creak. Wind pushed through gantries lined with white glaze, and the metal stairs on the pad wore icicles like teeth. In the spotlights before sunrise, frost made the orange tank look ghost pale. Teams in parkas walked the pad with cameras and measuring sticks, noting thickness, tapping rails, calling in ice reports that stacked up like a foreign language in a place built for fire. The countdown clock paused and resumed, then paused again. A late meeting asked if ice could break loose and damage the orbiter, if cold would change engine performance, if the day could still be pulled back. It could, came the chain of answers. The call to continue moved from console, and when it reached the top, the mission marched. In that bright, hard air, no one could see a small hidden uncertainty in a seam on the right-hand solid rocket booster, at the aft field joint closest to the flame trench. During assembly, the joint is packed with zinc chromate putty to act as a heat shield, and the O-rings behind it are seated by a low-pressure test. Investigators later noted that this seating pressure, about 200 pounds per square inch, could create a blowhole through the putty, a narrow tunnel unknown to the teams on the ground. If such a path existed, The O-rings were not fully protected, especially when they were cold, stiff, and slow to spring into place. On this day, it was not an abstract possibility. It was a condition waiting for the instant of truth. The sun came up, and the ice did not melt. On the launch pad, the vehicle breathed white oxygen like winter smoke. The astronauts climbed into Challenger and buckled into narrow couches, settling into routines that quiet fear by turning it into steps and callouts. The teacher in the crew, Krista McAuliffe, smiled and checked her notes. Outside, the image beamed to classrooms across the country where children gathered on linoleum floors, their teachers pointing at a television with pride that brushed up against nerves. The countdown held once more for wind, then fell into the now rhythm. 10 seconds, the main engines lit in a staggered roar, 3 bells flaring to full power and gimbaling to counter their own thrust. The shuttle flexed, a steel bow bending against cords pinned by 4 explosive bolts at each rocket. At 0, the command to ignite the boosters pulsed down the lines, and the seams that held question and hope together were asked to become certainty. Within a fraction of a second, ignition pressure slammed the field joints. The clevis and tang of the right booster's aft joint tried to rotate apart under the load, opening a hairline gap just as cold rubber needed to be fleet. The primary O-ring did not track as designed. It lacked. Combustion gases, carrying aluminum oxide and soot, found a path past the putty and into that sliver of daylight. Cameras later showed puffs of black smoke spitting from the joint in the first heartbeat of flight, a string of small exhalations that stopped almost as soon as they began. The gas had eaten a ribbon along the O-ring and burned through residue in the gap, but it also left behind a crust of oxide that acted like a temporary cork. For a time, that improvised barrier held. Challenger rose clean and bright, threading up through clear air that hit a river of fast shear above. The roll program took the stack from vertical into a bank that lined the trajectory downrange over the Atlantic. Inside the cabin, the crew worked steps that had been rehearsed until they sounded like memory. Throttle settings, pitch, verified. The controllers in Houston watched numbers, listened for anything that bent against expectation. On the coast, families and reporters craned their necks and squinted into that classic Florida blue, the bright trail drawing a curve you can still see if you close your eyes. From a distance, the climb looked perfect. Up close, in the inches that mattered, heat had already been where it should never reach. As the vehicle picked up speed, the air loads grew. High winds pushed, and the stack flexed, working its joints through small bending cycles. About a minute into ascent, near maximum dynamic pressure, the right booster's aft joint shifted just enough to crack the oxide plug and reopen the gap. A bright needle of flame pushed through. It was invisible to the naked eye in the white glare, but clear to long lenses, a growing tongue on the inboard side of the booster. What had been sealed by chance was opened by force. The jet cut toward the external tank. It is hard to grasp the speed of what followed. The flame impinged on the structural strut that tied the booster to the orbiter and tank, a stout link never designed to see that kind of heat. The plume also licked the lower part of the liquid hydrogen tank, a thin-walled aluminum shell full of cryogenic fuel at pressure. Within a few seconds, the metal lost strength. Sensors in the system hinted at what sight could not say. Telemetry showed shifts in pressure and attitude that could be read as small murmurs of a growing wrong. The flight director did not have a picture of the flame. The crew did not see a leak. They flew, and in the control room, the words remained calm. About a minute and a quarter into flight, the crew and the ground exchanged a routine check on engine throttle. Moments later, the fixed strut gave way, and the lower part of the hydrogen tank opened. Liquid hydrogen spilled into open air and met oxygen and flame. Forces that had been held in balance snapped outward. The orbiter, still attached to the tank and to a thrusting booster, yawed into wind load it could not survive. In a bloom of vapor and debris, Challenger broke apart. Television screens filled with a branching white cloud and two hard white tracks erupting outward, the twin boosters flying on like startled violent animals suddenly set free. Silence held for a terrible half-second, the human brain bargaining with what it saw. At the Cape, voices from the press site spilled into a low wail. In Houston, the public affairs officer said the line heard by millions. He said there had been a major malfunction. The signal went out to classrooms, to office break rooms, to the people who had gone outside to watch from parking lots with their hands on their brows. Time slowed and did not stop. The boosters arced in divergent plumes until the range safety officer sent the destruct commands. The sound of the detonation reached the shore late, a second shock to a crowd that had already learned. Within minutes, helicopters from Patrick Air Force Base were in the air. Coast Guard cutters and Navy vessels turned their bows toward a widening field of floating wreckage. What had been a single machine became tens of thousands of pieces across the Atlantic, white tiles and wiring harnesses and cork and foam, each with a meaning both intimate and vast. Recovery maps sketched ellipses based on wind and current. Divers worked in cold water with low visibility, feeling over silted sands and reef lines for shapes that did not belong there. Every bagged fragment, every marked panel, was a sentence of the story returning to shore. The boosters told the first chapter in hard strokes. They had separated while still live and tumbled, scarred by explosive charges and by their own failure. Pieces of the right-hand aft segment, torn and water-scored, were hauled onto decks and into hangars. Metallurgists studied clevis teeth and tang flanges. The signs were clear to trained eyes. The signs were clear to trained eyes. Heat had darkened and roughened the steel of the right booster joint, and a thin soot trace marked the path the gas had carved. The elastic rings, meant as the final barrier, showed erosion that matched the camera views of the first black smoke and the inboard jet that appeared a minute later. The joint leaked at ignition, sealed itself for a time, then failed under load. This was not theory first. It was what the hardware said. On paper and in the hearing rooms that came later, committees would look at every other story the mind could draft in a hunt for cause. Could propellant have cracked? Could a casing have split? Was there a fire in the main engine bay? A thruster misfire? An engine out that cascaded? Could the journey from the assembly building to the pad have flexed the booster enough to load the joint beyond its design? Investigators wrote down each possibility, invited private citizens with their own theories, and checked. And as the evidence mounted, the answers returned to one path. The preponderance of the record pointed to the failure of the joint between the casings and the right-hand booster's aft field location. There was no credible sign of a parallel failure, no separate hidden accident riding in the shadow of the obvious. Footage was reviewed frame by frame, the kind of viewing that turns a living moment into a sequence of still frames burning in the dark. The early puffs of smoke were there, flicking out of the cleft for a few beats and then gone. The plume at about a minute appeared where the joint faced the tank, a shape that grew and narrowed as if cutting with a torch. Temperature estimates based on color and analysis told how fast the metal would have softened. Models of joint rotation under pressure explained the opening of the gap. When paired with the known effect of cold on rubber recovery, the picture locked into place. The propellant did its job. The main engines did their job. The flaw was a seal in a place designed as a seal, exposed by cold and by an imperfect protection system that could hide a blowhole and let fire walk in. Divers recovered more of the orbiter weeks later, including the crew compartment. This section of the story belongs to the families more than to any analysis, and it is enough here to say that the impact with the sea was not survivable. For the investigation's purposes, the sequence before breakup mattered most. The telemetry did not show a cabin depressurization before the vehicle broke apart. The known cues pointed once more away from secondary faults and back toward the joint whose leak undermined the tank and the stack's strength. The physics of ascent at that moment, the aerodynamic stress and the rush of wind shear, did the rest when the truss went and the tank opened. Inside NASA's working groups, engineers who had years of experience with the booster's quirks sat with pieces of char and grain and steel on the table. The field joints clevis and tang were not theoretical to them. They had skinned their knuckles on those parts. They had shimmied tolerances. They had poured chalk over the same drawings enough to know the ink by its smell. A finding that matched their deepest worry carried a kind of dull recognition. At the same time, others in the program had to confront the fact that the safety system meant to ride above daily noise had slept. The line from a decision room in the cold night to a burn in bright morning ran through institutional judgment as much as through glass-smooth rubber and machined steel. That reckoning belonged to the next phase, but its shadow already lay across the hangar floor. Even in the earliest hours, pieces of the contractor's memos and temperature charts reached the teams tasked with answering first what happened, then how. Those papers had warned that the rings would be slow to seal in cold conditions. The ice teams on the pad were not asked to judge joint resilience. They were sent to look for falling chunks and thermal hazards on the tank and orbiter surfaces, with cameras that spoke in images and rulers that measured only what they could touch. None of that addressed what was about to happen inside a hidden corner of the right boost. That is the punishing nature of systems this complex. You can flood a pad with spotlights and still miss the darkness under your feet. The cameras kept what the naked eye could not. The data revealed what the cameras could not see. Burned and bent steel fragments told what the data could not feel. Piece by piece, the accident rewound itself, from a powder-white cloud and a rain of fragments, to a thin, jagged tongue of flame, back to a line of black puffs, back to a cold ring, asking for a second it no longer had. When a finding survives that much cross-check, it does more than convince. It clarifies. The record would name the cause as the failure of the aft field joint between the casings of the right-hand solid rocket booster. In a sea of grief and speculation that Anchor held, across the country, the image of the branching plume ran on endless loops. It in classrooms that had expected cheers, and instead learned what silence can do. It played in design labs and on test stands, where engineers stopped at their benches and faced what they had missed. A line on a chart, a note about putty under test pressure, a slide about cold-soaked O-rings. None of it had stopped the countdown. In these rooms, the question shifted from how the machine died to how the decision lived. We will not go there yet. We keep our eyes on the launch morning, on the field joint, and on the minutes that followed, because every later conclusion will be measured against what that metal and that rubber endured. When the search slowed and the evidence catalogs grew, the next step was a formal commission with sworn hearings. They would ask what kind of culture puts a system in a place where a SEAL must save a mission, instead of a mission protecting a SEAL. They would ask how a night of cold, a morning of ice, a test that could pocket a blowhole in putty, and a new way of demanding proof could add up to a signature written in smoke on a winter sky. Before those questions, the record had found its physical core. The right-hand booster's aft field joint had failed. This was not an opinion seeking authority. It was the only story that fit each frame, each trace, each scar. 73 seconds is not long in a life, but in rocketry it stretches into an age. It holds ignition and joy, heavy air and light, and the way voices steady when fear is highest. It holds every step a team takes to turn danger into ritual. On this morning, those seconds also held the cost of a system that let warning pass and let the weather write its own line into a plan. Cameras caught smoke where none should be, flame where none should live, and a machine unraveling because a SEAL did not hold. The country felt the truth before the words arrived. The investigation would give those words form. The work ahead was to walk back through the rooms where a hard no became a yes, where a caution became a chart note, and where the language of risk persuaded itself it was benign. That walk comes next. They gathered beneath bright television lights and the seal of the United States, a semicircle of commissioners facing rows of microphones and a nation that wanted both explanation and blame. In the first sessions, the questions sounded procedural, almost dry. What were the temperatures? What was the launch window? Which approvals were signed? Then the human stories started to cut through the language of charts and checklists. Engineers stepped forward, raised their right hands, and spoke about what they had tried to say before the launch. Managers followed, bound by the same oath, and described a process they believed had been careful and proper. The distance between those two perspectives became the subject of the entire inquiry. The Rogers Commission, named for former Secretary of State William Rogers, approached the disaster in layers. First, the physics, so there would be no doubt about the mechanism. Then the process, so there would be no doubt about the decisions. The Commission's report would run to hundreds of pages, weaving together recovery evidence, telemetry, film analysis, and testimony into a simple core finding. The right-hand solid rocket booster failed at the aft field joint, where a single Vuitton O-ring, cold and slow, did not seal when the booster pressurized. That part became indisputable. The harder work lay in uncovering how such a known vulnerability could pass through a system designed to prevent it. The paper trail did not begin on launch day. The record already held memos from earlier reviews that had flagged hazards inside the joint. One team warned that the internal pressurization used to seat the primary O-ring, about 200 pounds per square inch, could drive gases through the putty, form a blowhole, and leave the O-rings exposed. Such a flaw would not be visible before flight. Putty was meant to act as a heat shield, but a blowhole turned it into a tunnel. The Commission did not treat that as a rare edge case. It saw it as a red flag that should have pushed the design, the tests, and the launch rules toward greater caution. Among the most searing moments were the sworn accounts from the contractor team. Alan MacDonald of Morton Thiokol told the panel that on the night before launch, he declined to sign the certificate stating the boosters were ready. He spoke of the cold, of past erosion and soot blow-by in the joints, and of a late-night teleconference that ended with a reversal of his company's initial no-go. Roger Boisioli, an engineer who had written warnings months earlier, said he believed the joint could fail in low temperatures. He explained how O-rings lost resiliency in the cold and how the rubber needed to squeeze shut quickly as the steel case flexed under pressure. The words were technical, but the tone was moral. We warned. We were not heard. The commissioners wanted more than emotion. They asked for charts, raw data, meeting notes, and the official launch paperwork. William Rogers and Neil Armstrong, who also served on the panel, pressed on the formal flight readiness review records and the pathway by which concerns should have traveled. It was here that a pattern emerged. The FAR documentation for the mission, despite months of problem reports on joint erosion, did not elevate the O-ring issue into a constraint that could halt the countdown. The tracking systems that should have flagged unresolved hazards looked tidy instead. The language of risk had been softened into an explanation. Erosion had occurred before, and flight had continued. Therefore, erosion was bounded and tolerable. General Donald Kutina, an Air Force officer with experience in launch operations, began to pressure test those narratives. He sensed that the correlation between cold temperature and seal performance was not being treated with the gravity it deserved. In public sessions, he asked questions that looked simple and felt loaded. How does rubber behave at 30 degrees? How does a joint close when steel contracts? Behind the scenes, he received clues from fellow Commissioner Sally Ride, who had access to a contractor chart that drew a stark line between temperature and joint distress. Kutina could not disclose the route by which he knew. Instead, he pointed curiosity like a flashlight in just the right spot. The commissioner best equipped to turn that flashlight into proof was Richard Feynman, a Nobel Prize. winning physicist invited to join the panel. Feynman brought not only technical acuity but a gift for translation. In one televised session, he placed a piece of O-ring material into a glass of ice water, held it for a moment, then squeezed it with pliers and released it. The rubber did not spring back. It rested in its pinched shape as if tired, as if winter had stolen its memory. Feynman looked up, and in his calm, blunt voice, explained that at these temperatures, the material could not respond quickly enough to seal a rapidly pressurizing joint. The demonstration cut through months of euphemism. The country saw why the morning's frost mattered. What came after those scenes mattered as much as the spectacle. The commission dug into the analysis management used to overrule the engineers. It found that the decision to launch rested on a faulty model of the joint's behavior. That model treated past erosion as evidence of margin, not as a warning of a defective seal design. The safety, reliability, and quality assurance functions, which should have served as independent critics, had been weakened. They could not enforce strict problem tracking or challenge the logic that normalized O-ring damage. The report's language was measured and devastating. It described a system that convinced itself a red light was green. In one section, the commissioners mapped the night before launch. Thiokol engineers argued to delay based on temperature. Managers at the Marshall Space Flight Center pushed back, asking for data that could prove a no-go rather than recognizing that missing proof was itself cause for caution. The initial response to the engineers' warnings, skeptical, framing their judgment as unfounded, contributed to Thiokol management's turnaround when they made their final recommendation. What had begun as a clear statement to wait became a cautious yes, justified by reinterpreted charts and a desire not to miss another window. The commission did not portray this as malice. It portrayed it as a breach of discipline under pressure. The commission's staff then followed how that breach showed up in the paperwork. In a rational system, an unresolved hazard as serious as a joint that could fail catastrophically would be stated clearly in the flight readiness review and in the launch constraint logs. The panel found the opposite. The FAR kept a veneer of normalcy. The hazard analyses leaned on assumptions that downplayed temperature effects and treated putty as a barrier, even though internal reviews had warned that pressurization could punch a blowhole through it and expose the very seals it was meant to guard. These were not abstract critiques. They were the paper trail of a normalization process. Beyond the commission, Congress conducted its own review through the House Committee on Science and Technology. The committee's report echoed much of the commission's work and pressed the point. It found that NASA's safety oversight had grown grossly inadequate, that joint testing and certification had not shown safe performance across different conditions, and that both the agency and the contractor failed to heed warning signs of a flawed design. Where the House broke with the popular shorthand of communication failure, it stated the core problem more plainly. The hardware was wrong, and the system refused to face that fact. Back in the hearing room, managers from Marshall and from the contractor offered their accounts. They believed they had followed procedure, consulted expertise, and conducted a proper flight readiness review. Lawyers and commissioners asked where, in that proper process, the specific low-temperature hazard had been recorded. At what step the burden of proof had shifted from "show me why it is safe" to "show me why." The answers described meetings, waivers, and interpretations. On paper, all was in accordance with established procedure. In reality, the procedure had been stripped of the friction it needed to stop a launch. Feynman's role expanded beyond the ice water demonstration. He led technical deep dives into the joint's mechanics, studied photographs of soot patterns and zinc oxide deposits, and reviewed internal correspondence. In an appendix to the final report, he captured the lesson in a line that would echo far beyond aerospace. For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. It was not a flourish. It was a diagnosis. The Commission had uncovered a culture where optimism set the terms of analysis. It treated the absence of disaster as proof that systems were robust, and it promoted the schedule as if it were a requirement of physics. General Kutina, quietly methodical, kept returning to the temperature. He asked why the contractor's data cutoff excluded the coldest flights. He asked why a launch morning that sat far below the historical envelope did not trigger an automatic hold. The panel learned that the historical data set was thin where it mattered most. The few previous cold launches showed more erosion. The coldest recovered joint hardware showed more soot blow by. It was a trend crying for restraint. The Commission did not need a perfect model to act. It needed a clear-as-day mismatch between the morning and the proven safety envelope. And that mismatch was obvious. When the final report arrived, it spoke in the plainest terms. The proximate cause of the accident was the failure of the right-hand solid rocket booster, aft field joint. The temperature at launch reduced the O-ring's ability to seal. Hot gases escaped through a joint that never properly sealed, eroded the putty in the secondary ring, and ignited a flame that led to the loss of vehicle and crew. The decision to launch had been based on a faulty engineering analysis of the joint seal behavior. Safety oversight structures had not functioned independently. The attempts by engineers to raise temperature concerns had been resisted in a way that contributed to a compromised recommendation. Within the volumes, small details made the findings undeniable. Recovery teams brought up segments of the right-hand booster with char patterns that matched a jet issuing from the aft field joint. Long focus cameras showed a puff of black smoke at ignition, then a bright flame as the vehicle climbed. The joint's zinc chromate putty, meant to protect the O-rings, had likely concealed a blowhole, a hidden weakness noted in earlier reviews, and impossible to see before flight. Taken together, the picture held. The physics matched the evidence matched the timeline, and the timeline pointed back to a launch that should not have happened. Not all of the reckoning was external. Within NASA, there were moments of conscience on the stand. Some managers admitted that, in retrospect, the signals had been there. Others defended their calls while acknowledging that their safety apparatus lacked bite. The organizational chart looked intact, but its safety branch did not possess the authority or independence to slow momentum. A program bent on proving itself, routine did not reward voices that complicated that routine. In the quiet after testimony, you could feel the weight of an agency recognizing that its internal feedback loop had failed. The Commission also asked the counterfactual questions the public needed answered. Would a delay have mattered? Would a warmer day have changed the outcome? The technical record said yes. The O-rings regained elasticity at higher temperatures. The risk of blow-by decreased as the rubber could seat quickly and track the moving steel. The House committee drove the point home from a different angle. The concerns raised the night before launch had been passed to the highest decision levels with their full force. The launch would have been deferred. There would have been no accident that day. These were not guesses. They arose from materials science and from the system's own launch rules when those rules were applied correctly. The paper trail around flight readiness reviews became a symbol in its own right. In theory, the FARA concentrated the hardest questions in a single ritual. In practice, for this flight, it concentrated answers. The Commission wrote that problem tracking did not function as a skeptical ledger. Hazard analyses were not challenged by safety with enough rigor. The independent perspective that senior NASA managers needed at those reviews was not present. Meanwhile, the contractor's evolving worries about low temperature and seal response did not appear in the FAR portfolio as an active constraint. A door that should have been locked stood open. The Commission did not confine its gaze to one center or one contractor. It wrote about program structure, about the ways budget constraints had shaped choices, about how optimism around the shuttle's reusability turned to pressure to keep flights on the calendar. But it resisted the temptation to dissolve personal responsibility into abstract forces alone. Individuals had made calls. Individuals had resisted or accepted doubt. A culture that eased the path of optimistic calls still contained people who pushed back, who wrote memos, who said stop. The fact that the launch went forward was not inevitable. It was preventable. There were tender moments, too, often not captured in the formal record. Family members in the audience, engineers avoiding each other's eyes in hallways, astronauts who knew the crew and sat with their grief and their guilt. The inquiry had to make sense of system failure without stripping it of humanity. When a commission staffer summarized an engineer's testimony as a moment of conscience, you could feel the slice of what it means to work at the edge of the possible. The investigation did not paint villains and heroes in primary colors. It showed a chain where one weak link, then another, then a dozen more, reached a morning colder than any before. By the time the commissioners closed their final open session, the stakes were clear. They were not just reconstructing an accident. They were tracing the failure paths that any high-risk, high-consequence system can enter when it forgets to doubt itself. Their critique rested on the smallest facts, like the bounce of a rubber ring, the range of a thermometer, and the soot's signature on steel. It also reached up to the largest structures, from safety independence to management communication. They stayed precise enough to be useful and broad enough to be a warning. The paper volumes went to the printers. The cameras left the hearing room. The reckoning did not end with a press conference. It continued in the corners of the program, where procedures would need to be rebuilt, where accountability would be assigned with care, and where the launch rules would be written again in the conservative language that flight test demands. The commission had answered the central question of how the red flag turned green. What remained was how to use that answer, and how to make sure that when the next winter morning arrived, the system would hear the truth and stop. They began with metal, drawings, and cold numbers. In the months after the hearings, engineers took the burned joint that had betrayed them and reduced it to first principles. If high pressure rotated the joint and unseated the seals, then the joint had to be built so it could not rotate in the first place. The redesign captured the tang inside the clevis, so load would lock the interface rather than pry it apart, and the sealing system was strengthened and made more tolerant to low temperatures. Heaters were added to keep seals warm before flight. Insulation was revised, and the old practices that let blow-by find a path were cut out of the equation. Then they tested static firings at temperatures that once would have raised eyebrows, and now had to raise data instead. Hardware was only one layer. Another ran through meetings, signatures, and the power to say no. The Rogers Commission stated it plainly. The O-ring failure was the immediate cause, but a flawed decision-making process was an equal, perhaps greater factor. A system that truly prioritized safety would have flagged the mounting doubts about the solid rocket booster joint seals. Had those doubts, in the engineer's own words, been presented in the flight readiness process in their true terms, the launch likely would not have occurred when it did. That finding held up a mirror in every conference room. It asked not only how the rocket was built, but how the next decision would be made. NASA answered by changing who listened and who could be heard. The safety, reliability, and quality assurance organizations were given more independence and a direct line up the chain. Dissent would no longer be a private discomfort. It had to be visible, documented, and if unresolved, elevated to the highest levels. The Flight Readiness Review was rewritten so that a waiver could not blur the difference between a known hazard and a solved problem. Can you show me it is unsafe? To the older and wiser standard, can you show me it is safe? In practice, that meant more time, colder tests, and a slower yes. It was a deliberate friction, placed there to keep heat from rushing past. Congress conducted its own inquiry, and pressed even harder on the lessons. The Commission had stressed a flawed process and broken communication, but a House committee widened the critique to include the years that came before. It found that the core problem was poor technical decision-making over time by top NASA and contractor personnel, who failed to act decisively as anomalies mounted in the booster joints. Information about design flaws and prior mission problems was widely available and briefed at every level. Even so, test and certification programs were inadequate, and warnings that the design was defective did not trigger a redesign when they should have. The committee also agreed on a second crucial point. Safety, reliability, and quality assurance programs within NASA were grossly inadequate, and the agency needed a complete risk management program. A fresh review of all criticality, one redundant items, and a study of how to give shuttle crews a means of escape during controlled, gliding flight. That last item became a modest but very human change. No system could save a crew from a booster joint failure at max dynamic pressure. But a side hatch escape for a controlled glide offered a narrow path for some failure cases that left the orbiter intact. It was not a perfect answer. It was not meant to be. It signaled a shift in posture. Engineers would still aim to prevent the fire, but leaders now had to think through what candor demanded if prevention failed. Normalization of deviance sounds ordinary, but it names a deadly idea. When a system tolerates an anomaly without consequence, it becomes easier to treat that anomaly as margin. A ring erodes, the flight lands, the pattern holds, and the human mind learns the wrong lesson. The pressure around the shuttle helped that habit take root. Managers were driven by outside demands, a national showcase, military payloads, paying customers, and the agency absorbed those demands as a schedule. A single line from the night before the launch shows how that weight pressed into a sentence. Hearing the engineers' objections, the booster project manager at Marshall said, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch next April?" It reads as frustration and sounds like impatience, yet it carried a deeper inversion. In that room, the burden of proof had already shifted. The engineers were being asked to prove danger instead of the system being asked to prove safety. That inversion is one of the most useful lenses we can carry forward. The data are sparse. If the environment is outside prior experience, and if the system is criticality 1, single point failure with no redundancy, then the conservative stance is simple. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The Challenger record shows how quickly that clarity can blur. A manager hears that it was cold before, and nothing broke. An engineer hears that it was cold before, and the seal eroded, which is the point. Both are looking at flights that succeeded, but only one is listening for the question that matters. What changed the joint that morning was not success or failure the week before. It was physics, and physics does not negotiate. So how do we prevent the next ignored warning? We can start by labeling the moves that cause it to vanish. First, watch for burden of proof inversions. When a debate turns to, "Prove to me we will lose the vehicle," in a regime with poor data and high consequence, the conversation has already lost its anchor. Second, listen for missing dissent. Healthy organizations do not just welcome objection. They expect it, and they leave a paper trail that shows who objected, what was done, and why a no became a go. If the record is strangely clean, if the minutes show only agreement, if a constraint is waived on argument rather than proof, the warning has already slipped into silence. Third, respect environmental boundaries. A design has never been certified at a given temperature, pressure, or load. That boundary is not a suggestion. It is a limit. Moving past it without new data is not bold, it is blind. These are not abstract pointers. They are the practical residue of a shuttle lost and a record of meetings that did not save it. They also come with obligations tied to roles. For engineers, the duty is blunt. Do not let uncertainty hide inside politeness. Name the failure mode. Quantify what you can and explain what you cannot. And if the time, data, or physics do not allow a demonstration of safety, then hold the line. Alan MacDonald did exactly that when he refused to sign off on the launch recommendation. He did not win the night, but in the sunlight of the inquiry, he became one of the clearest voices in the room, because he had drawn a line when it counted. Engineers like Roger Boisjoly carried both the warning and the cost. Their courage, and in some cases their suffering, underlines why duty of candor is not just a phrase. It is a professional ethic with human stakes. For managers and leaders, the duty is different, but no softer. Build structures that do not allow dissent to disappear in the layers below. The Commission noted that top decision makers said they did not know, on January 27th, that the arguments had been intense. They added that they would not have approved the launch if they had heard the engineers' views. If that is true, then the system must be rebuilt so intense engineering controversy cannot die in middle management. That means documented dissent paths, recorded minority opinions at reviews, and a standing rule that unresolved technical objections move up, not sideways. It also means setting schedules that do not treat safety as a variable cost. When the calendar becomes the measure of success, even good people start to ask the wrong questions. Independent safety only earns its name when it can say no without fear. That is a budget decision as much as an org chart. If the safety organization depends on the program it oversees for funding, performance ratings, or promotion, independence will fade the first time it becomes inconvenient. After Challenger, NASA elevated safety and quality groups, drew firmer reporting lines, and added external oversight. Those steps mattered. They also had to be used. A strong process cannot enforce judgment, but it can slow down a bad one long enough for judgment to return. There is also a quieter lesson about evidence. Before the launch, a plot of O-ring erosion versus temperature would have looked sparse and inconclusive to anyone seeking certainty. Yet the deep logic was still there, waiting to be heard. Cold rubber becomes stiff. Stiff seals take longer to respond. High pressure arrives fast. In environments where evidence is thin and the consequences are absolute, it is reasonable to act on mechanism and bounds. This is not an excuse to make fear-based choices. It is permission to respect physics when data have not yet had time to accumulate. Mechanism plus consequence equals restraint. What changed inside NASA could be seen in the cadence of the next years. Launch rates slowed. Flight readiness reviews turned heavier. The redesigned boosters performed. The shuttle flew again, not because anyone forgot, but because enough people agreed not to normalize the cost of remembering. The same choices play out in every domain that lives near risk. In hospitals, when a nurse speaks up about a dosage that looks wrong. In aviation, when a mechanic grounds an aircraft for a vibration that others call familiar. In software, when a deployment is paused because a test fails intermittently and no one yet knows why. In finance, when a model that priced the past cannot explain the present. The surface details change, but the pattern is stable. Pressure tries to outrun evidence. Evidence must set the pace. Sometimes, despite reform and resolve, the habit returns. The space program would learn that a second time, with falling foam and a wing that was not built for impact. That later lesson, and the safety center, created in its wake, confirms another truth. Cultural drift is not a one-time fix. It is a daily practice built into how meetings end, who writes minutes, and when someone feels heard. The answer to normalization of deviance is not a speech or a poster. It is a sequence of small decisions that reset the default toward caution without paralyzing work. Each of those decisions flows from a simple commitment. Whenever an anomaly appears, treat it as a gift, not an inconvenience. Ask whether the system understood the environment that produced it. Ask whether the models predicted it, and if they did not, change the models or change the rules. Hold off on words like acceptable, not to be theatrical, but to avoid teaching yourself the wrong lesson. Acceptable is a destination, not a reflex. When a pattern of small exceptions starts to appear, halt and gather the story those exceptions are trying to tell. It is slower, and often against the grain of goals that are easy to chart and celebrate. It is also how 7 people get to come home. 1 human point lingers after the reports are shelved. Accountability is not the same as blame. Blame burns hot, moves fast to a target, then cools. Accountability is built into the work so decisions have stewards, data have owners, and the power to approve carries the duty to listen, document, and defend the choice in the open. After Challenger, some careers ended, and others were rebuked. The more valuable result was a slow reweaving of authority. So the next argument about SEALs would not die unheard. It is an ongoing craft, not a verdict. To know how to act on warnings, look at what people did when the costs were clear. The Commission called for reviews of every criticality 1 item and its hazards, and that demand still works today. Map the single points of failure, then refuse to let that list gather dust. Put those items in front of the room on a fixed schedule. Ask for fresh analysis when conditions change. Do not assume last quarter's fix holds in winter or after a new load is added. If the team cannot show safety because time is short or data are thin, the only honest move is to stop, gather the data, and return when the question has an answer. The Challenger crew trained for their tasks and trusted a chain of decisions that had to be worthy of that trust. Every future crew asks the same thing in silence. They inherit the hardware, the procedures, and the culture we leave them. When we say never again, we are not writing a promise in granite. We are committing to the practice of hearing, to accepting the friction of caution, to letting technical truth change plans, even when millions are watching and calendars are crowded. We are agreeing, in effect, to keep the burden of proof where it belongs. So we close the loop with plain guidance. You prevent the next ignored warning by making it impossible to ignore. You build systems that surface dissent, not bury it. You slow down decisions where physics runs ahead of proof. You protect the people who say wait, and you ask for demonstrations of safety rather than wagers on success. You do this in rockets and hospitals, factories and code bases, because the logic that brought heat through a joint is the same logic that threads through complex work everywhere. It is not cynicism to plan for error. It is respect for reality. Those last images from that January morning have played so many times that the mind turns them into a loop without asking why. But the cause is the point, and the lesson matters. We should launch again only when we can bring into the room what was missing that night. A chain of evidence that can bear weight, a path that carries descent to the top, and leaders willing to trade applause for margin. Warnings are not our enemies. They are the tools that tune ambition to what the world will allow, so the sky stays a place we reach for and return from, with the same number of people we sent.